Zoche Park, the South Library, in the soft Kent November afternoon of the 4th of November 1819. My dear Amelia, I write to you what I have meant to write these 28 years, and have not had the patience to set down before the matter has required. Dr. Stanhope of Tonbridge has been at the long autumnal decline of his patience these 4 months past. He gives me, in his careful Tonbridge wisdom, until the close of December at the most. I shall ask Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge, of High Street, Tunbridge, to lay this letter at your hand at the Zouche on the Weald Parsonage, at his proper time after probate. You shall have heard of me only in passing. Your late uncle, Mr. Marmaduke Zoche, was my own husband, Sir Hadrian's younger brother. The two parted at Sir Hadrian's marriage in 1788, my own father-in-law, the Reverend Octavius Zoche of Rochester, having taken in the matter the part I cannot now press the dust upon. By the will, Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge shall read, you are sole heiress to Zouche Park, 152 acres, the walled south garden, the hop yard, the apple and cherry orchard, the South Library, the Zouche family plate, and 3,250 in the 3%. I have followed your London theatre going at your Aunt Mrs. Hester Lonsdale's house in Russell Street these 5 years through her gentle quarter-day accounts. Your Green Calf Theatre Journal of 1814, 1819, Mrs. Siddons's late benefit nights, Mr. Kean's Hamlet, Miss O'Neill's Juliet, is very fine, my dear Amelia. Mr. Henry Crabb Robinson at the Inner Temple holds the same opinion. He has seen your journal at Mrs. Lonsdale's salon at Easter 1817. I wish to think that the South Library at Zouche Park shall be at your hand from the spring of 1820 onwards, the bound playbills of 1782, 1819. I have kept at the South Library writing table since my own marriage in 1791, are for your hand. Mrs. Isham at the housekeeper's keys, Mr. Mainwaring at the home pasture, Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge at the south door, and the Reverend Belling at the parish living of St. Peter's. These shall receive you. They are honest and kind. I am sorry that I have not in your 28 years come over the 6 Kentish miles between us. The asking pardon of an old great-aunt at the close of her time is the only asking pardon at her hand to give. Your loving great-aunt, Cordelia Zouche. P.S. At the South Library writing table, you shall find my own bound playbills of 1782, 1819 plus, my own Green Calf Theatre Journal of 33 years at Covent Garden, Drury Lane, and the Haymarket. They are for your hand. C.Z. Wednesday, the 22nd of December, 1819. The Kent morning came down the Weald in plain December light, and the chestnut hangers to the south of the Zouche on the Weald Parsonage stood under a low sky, the colour of pewter. A thin frost had laid itself over the parsonage south garden before the daylight had risen, and the holly at the south door still held the silver of it. Amelia Zoche was gentle 5'5", soft auburn hair plaited at the nape under a small lace cap, warm hazel eyes the colour of Kentish honey, fair Weald complexion, in unrelieved black mourning gabardine for her late great-aunt, the testatrix. She sat at the worn parsonage writing table at the south parlour window, the Green Calf Theatre Journal at her left hand, and a small folded playbill of Covent Garden at her right. She was finishing the journal entry on Miss Eliza O'Neill's Juliet at Covent Garden the Tuesday evening of the 16th of November 1819. The performance had been at her Aunt Mrs. Hester Lonsdale's first-tier box, number 14, at the Bow Street side of the house. The entry had run at the right-hand page these 3 days past. The potion scene at the close of Act 4, Miss O'Neill's small-held silence at the line "Shall I not then be stifled in the vault?" The weight of the verse she gave at the line "My dismal scene I needs must act alone." The ink was the plain iron gall the Tunbridge stationer kept for the parsonage account, The Green Calf Theatre Journal she had kept since 1814, Mrs. Siddons's late benefit night performances at Covent Garden, 1815 through 1818, Mr. Edmund Kean's Shylock and Hamlet at Drury Lane, 1814 through 1819, Miss Eliza O'Neill's Juliet at Covent Garden, 1814 through 1819, and the entries ran at the right-hand pages in her plain Kentish hand, and the parallel playbills at the left, in small loose pockets she had stitched at the binding herself. The parsonage at Zouch-on-the-Weald was a low honeystone house of 2 stories at the lane south of St. Peter's, with a tiled porch and a slate roof, and the parish glebe of 6 acres at the back. Reverend Octavius Zouch, her widowed father, had been curate of St. Peter's since 1798. Her late mother, Mrs. Sarah Zouch, had died at her birth in 1791. The house had its parlour at the south, its kitchen and dairy at the east, its study and small library at the west, and at the upper floor, the 4 small chambers in the Kentish parsonage fashion of the last century. The parlour at the chimney-piece kept the small Kentish quiet of a country morning, and Amelia heard at the lane the iron rim of a hired chaise come down from the Tonbridge turnpike. The chaise was a Tonbridge one. She knew it at the wheel-note before she had crossed to the window. And it drew up at the south door of the parsonage in the plain December manner of a man on settled business. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge was 60, gold spectacles, plain dark wool. He came down at the parsonage step with a black leather dispatch case at his hand. He had been her late great-aunt's solicitor these 11 years, and probate at the will of Mrs. Cordelia Zouch of Zouch Park had been granted at the Canterbury Consistory the Friday previous. Amelia rose and went out at the parsonage hall, and Mary the parsonage maid had already opened the south door at his hand. Reverend Octavius, her father, had come down from the west study with his plain black coat over his cassock, the small ribbon at the collar he kept for parish callers. The 2 received Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge at the south parlour, and Mary brought up the tea-tray with the parsonage china and the plain seed cake the parsonage kept for Wednesdays. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge had at the parsonage hall taken off the plain dark wool greatcoat and laid the black beaver hat at the hall table beside the dispatch case. He stepped into the south parlour at the slow, plain pace of a Tonbridge man of business who knows that haste does not become a will-reading at a country parsonage. He bowed at Reverend Octavius Zouch at the parlour door, bowed at Miss Zouch at the south window, and laid the dispatch case at the parsonage table. Mary set the tea at the parlour table and withdrew at the hall door without a word. The parsonage cat, the small grey one Mrs. Octavius had kept since 1817, had taken itself out at the kitchen at the chaise wheel and did not come back at the south parlour. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge set the dispatch case at the parsonage table and opened it. He drew up from the case a sealed letter at the head, and at the seal the plain wax cipher of Mrs. Cordelia Zouch, CZ, and the small Zouch crest of the 3 hopbines was still entire. He laid the letter at the parsonage table at Amelia's hand, and said in his settled Tonbridge manner that the late Mrs. Zouch had asked, at her own particular instruction, that he should read the letter aloud at the parsonage in her hearing and at her father's hearing. Amelia sat at the parlour chair by the south window. Her father stood at the parlour door. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge broke the seal at the plain manner of a man who has done such an office many times, took up the gold spectacles to the nose, and read. He read the date and the address. He read the salutation. He read through to the end. The 28 years, Dr. Stanhope, the 152 acres, and the walled south garden, and the hop yard, and the apple and cherry orchard, and the south library, and the family plate, and the 3,250 in the 3%, the London theatre going at Mrs. Lonsdale's accounts, the Green Calf Theatre Journal, the bound playbills at the South Library writing table, the 4 servants and the parish curate, the 6 Kentish miles, the asking pardon, He read the closing and the signature. He read the postscript at the bound playbills and at Mrs. Cordelia's own Green Calf Theatre journal of 33 years. At the close of the reading, he laid the letter at the parsonage table at Amelia's hand, and was silent. Reverend Octavius Zouche, at the parlour door, said nothing. He had taken from the doorpost the plain Kentish silence of a curate who has heard a thing at the 28 years' remove, and shall not at the first hearing set it down in any other manner. Amelia sat at the parlour chair, and was silent also. She had not at the 28 years of her own remembering been at Zouche Park. She had heard of Mrs. Cordelia Zouche at the parsonage only in the plain Kentish passing mention of a parish curate's daughter whose late great-aunt was at the manor at the 6 miles north, a name at a Sunday account, a date at a parish register. The letter at Mr. Raysbury Tonbridge's hand had set the matter at the parsonage table in a manner the plain Kentish passing mention had not. Then she took up the letter at her own hand, read it over once at the plain December daylight from the south window, folded it at its first crease, and laid it at the parlour table. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge then drew up from the dispatch case the 6 items the will had appointed. The first was the copy of the will itself, 10 pages in Mr. Raysbury Tonbridge's clerk's plain hand, the schedule of the 152 acres, and the walled south garden, and the hop yard, and the apple and cherry orchard, and the plate of 78 pieces at the Tunbridge 1789 mark, and the south library, the 3,250 tires in the 3 per cents, the 4 servants, and the parish curate, and the executors. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge laid it at the parsonage table at Amelia's hand. The second was a brass ring of 5 keys at a plain length of black ribbon. The keys were the south door, the south library, the muniment room, the plate chest, and the hop store at the east. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge laid the ring at the parsonage table at Amelia's hand, and the brass at the December daylight had the dull warm tone of plate that has been at a Kentish housekeeper's keeping these 30 years. The third was a banker's draft at Hawes of Fleet Street for 3,254 shillings sterling, drawn at the 3 per cent stock and made out at the order of Miss Amelia Zouche of Zouche on the Weald Parsonage, Kent, dated the 18th of December 1819, countersigned at the Tonbridge branch the Tuesday previous. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge laid it at the parsonage table. The fourth was the calling card of Reverend Belling, curate of St. Peter's of Zouche on the Weald, with at the verso a written line in his plain hand. I shall wait at the south door of Zouche Park at Miss Zouche's arrival. R.B. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge laid it at the parsonage table. The fifth was the calling card of Lord Algernon Aubrey Glendower, 6th Earl of Glendower Castle, Kent, lay patron of the Zouche living, with at the verso a written line in his plain hand. At Miss Zouche's settled time, Glendower. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge laid it at the parsonage table. The 6th was a second sealed letter. The wax again, the small CZ cipher, and the 3 hop binds, the direction at the face in Mrs. Cordelia Zouche's own hand. To the Reverend Octavius Zouche, curate of St. Peter's of Zouche on the Weald, at the parsonage, at the proper time after Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge's reading. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge laid the letter at her father's hand at the parlour door. The 6 items lay at the parsonage south parlour table at the December daylight from the south window. The will, the brass ring of 5 keys at the black ribbon, the 3,250 draft at Hawes, the calling card of Reverend Belling, the calling card of Lord Glendower, and the second sealed mourning letter at her father's hand. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge then said his settled instruction. The Tunbridge chambers should be at Miss Zouche's command at any morning of the Christmas week. If she would write at the Monday following her acceptance at the will, and her appointed day at the arrival at Zouche Park, he should send word at Mrs. Isham and at Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge, and at Mr. Menwaring, and at Reverend Belling. The 5 keys would then be at her hand at the south door at the appointed day. He drank the tea Mary had set at his hand, ate a small portion of the seed cake, and at the close of his second cup took his leave. Reverend Octavius saw him out at the south door. The hired chaise drew off at the lane in the December manner of a Tonbridge solicitor at his second call of a country morning. Reverend Octavius Zouche came back at the south parlour and stood at the parsonage table. He took up the sealed morning letter Mrs. Cordelia had sent at his own hand. He looked at the wax, at the small CZ cipher and the 3 hotbinds, at the direction in Mrs. Cordelia's own hand. He drew the small black silk ribbon at his cassock pocket, set the letter at the parlour table, took up the silver paper knife at the chimney-piece, and broke the seal. He stood at the south window and read in plain Kentish silence. Amelia sat at the parlour chair and did not look at his face. The plain December daylight came in at the south window, across the seed cake plate, and the brass ring of 5 keys at the black ribbon, and the 3,250 draft, and the 2 calling cards. At the close of the reading, her father folded the letter, laid it at his cassock pocket, set his hand once at her shoulder, and went out at the parlour door to the west study without a word. Amelia sat at the parlour chair a long while at the south window. Then she rose, set the 6 items at the parsonage writing table, the will at the head, the keys at the right, the draft at the left, the 2 cards at the centre, the Green Calf Theatre Journal at the foot, and went out at the parlour to the small kitchen garden at the east of the parsonage, where Mary had set the chickens. She walked the kitchen garden path twice. The hens at the east coop took up the small parsonage clucking they kept for any step at the path, and Amelia went on at the south wall, and at the small parish glebe gate, and back at the parsonage south door. The 6 Kentish miles between Zouche on the wheeled parsonage and Zouche Park at the north lay over the wheeled road in the plain December manner, and she had, at the 28 years of her own life, not been at the 6 miles for any matter. The asking pardon at her late great-aunt's letter was at her hand to take up or to set down. She came back at the south parlour at the close of the afternoon, set the small candle at the parsonage writing table, took up the Green Calf Theatre Journal at the right-hand page she had left at the morning, drew the playbill of Covent Garden the 16th of November out at the small stitched pocket at the binding, and set the playbill at the left-hand page beside the entry. She had at the morning left the entry at the 2nd paragraph at the close of the potion scene, and Amelia, at her own settled practice, required the close of the entry at the day's end. She set the last 6 lines of the entry in plain Kentish English at the right-hand page of the Green Calf Theatre Journal. The considered observation she kept at her Kentish hand, the small remark on the Bow Street side of the first tier she set in the parallel manner. She set the quill at the inkstand, dusted the page with the small pounce-pot, and at the bottom of the right-hand page wrote in her plain hand the journal entry her own settled practice had appointed of her: O'Neill, Juliet, at Covent Garden. 16th November 1819, Mrs. Lonsdale's first-tier box, 14. Raisbury Tunbridge letter at the parsonage south parlour this morning. The 1820 London season at Aunt Lonsdale's shall begin at 12th night. She blotted the page, set the Green Calf Theatre Journal at the parsonage writing table beside the brass ring of 5 keys at the black ribbon, drew the small candle nearer, and sat at the south window in the closing Kentish dusk. The brass at the candle had taken the small amber light of the parsonage tallow. She did not at the dusk take the ring up. She set her own hand at the closed theatre journal at her right, and let it rest at the green calf cover, and at the parsonage south window the December evening came on in plain Kentish silence. The Monday following, the 27th of December 1819, she sat at the parsonage writing table at the south parlour, and, at her own plain hand, wrote at Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge of High Street, Tunbridge. She accepted the bequest at the will, accepted the appointment at the 6 items, named her appointed day at the arrival at Zouche Park at Saturday the 8th of January 1820, and asked that he should at the Tonbridge post Tuesday send word at Mrs. Isham the housekeeper, and at Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge the butler, and at Mr. Mainwaring the steward, and at Reverend Belling the parish curate. She signed the letter Amelia Zouche at the parsonage of Zouche on the Weald, sealed it at the small Zouche parsonage seal her father kept at the west study, and sent it at the Tonbridge post that afternoon at the parsonage boy. She wrote at the second sheet a short note at Reverend Belling at the parish living of Zouche on the Weald. In the plain Kentish hand, the parish curate would know at the first glance that she should be at Zouche Park the Saturday the 8th of January 1820, and that she should be at St. Peter's the Sunday the 9th of January 1820 at his parish service. She sealed it at the same small Zouche seal and sent it at the same Tunbridge post. She wrote at the third sheet a short note at Lord Glendower at Glendower Castle, Kent. In the plain hand, the lay patron of the parish living was owed at his calling card, to say that she had received at her hand his lay patron card at the parsonage, and that she should be at Zouche Park the Saturday the 8th of January 1820 in her late great-aunt's appointed manner. She did not say more. She sealed it at the same small Zouche seal, and sent it at the same Tunbridge post. She wrote at the fourth sheet a longer note at her Aunt Mrs. Hester Lonsdale at Russell Street, Bloomsbury Square. In the warm Kentish hand, a niece writes at the London aunt, who has held the first tier box at Covent Garden these 5 years past. She named the bequest at the will, and the 1820 London season at Russell Street at Twelfth Night, and the spring quarter at Zouche Park at the South Library from Lady Day onwards. She sealed it at the same small Zouche seal, and sent it at the same Tunbridge post. The Tonbridge postboy took the 4 letters at the parsonage door at the close of the afternoon. Amelia stood at the south door and watched him take the lane north at the Weald Road in the plain Kentish manner of a December dusk. Then she came back at the south parlour, set the brass ring of 5 keys at the parsonage writing table beside the Green Calf Theatre Journal and the small folded playbill of Covent Garden, and sat at the small candle at the south window a long while. Her father came down at the west study at the close of the evening, and the two sat at the parlour fire, at the seed-cake plate and the parsonage tea, and Reverend Octavius Zouche set his hand once at her hand, and said only in his plain Kentish manner that her late great-aunt's letter had been at his own asking pardon at the 28 years between, and that he would at her appointed day, the 8th of January 1820, see her at Zouche Park, at the south door, and at her settled inheritance at the will. He said nothing more of the contents of the letter at his cassock pocket. Amelia did not ask. The parlour fire burned down at the small hearth. The brass ring of 5 keys at the black ribbon lay at the parsonage writing table at the candle. The Green Calf Theatre Journal lay open at the entry on Miss O'Neill's Juliet at Covent Garden the Tuesday evening of the 16th of November, 1819. The Kentish night came down at the south window in the plain December manner of the Weald. Saturday the 8th of January 1820 came in the settled Kentish fashion of a January morning that had come to a quiet purpose, and the small parsonage of Zouche on the Weald was at its proper work at the gentle hour before dawn. The frost lay thin upon the south parlour sill of the parsonage. The Wealden air carried the long, honey-coloured stillness of the Kent country at the close of the night, and the parsonage stable-yard had been at the steady labour of the hour since the parsonage candles had been lit at the south parlour. The Reverend Octavius Zouche stood at the south parlour door in his plain dark wool, his Sunday cravat folded with the quiet care he had always given the matter, and Amelia Zouche at the south parlour writing table closed her writing case at the brass clasp and laid it at the small black travelling trunk her father had bought at Tunbridge the week before. She wore her settled black mourning gabardine for her late great-aunt the testatrix, a small black bonnet of plain crepe, and her auburn hair was plaited at the nape under a small lace cap. Mrs. Pelling of the parsonage kitchen had wrapped the cold parsonage breakfast in clean Wealden linen, and the small parsonage gig stood at the gate with the parsonage grey at the trace, the breath of the parsonage grey rising in the still Kentish air. The Zouche chaise from Zouche Park stood behind the gig at the gate, Mr. Menwaring's man at the bridle in plain Zouche livery, the chaise sent down the evening before by the steward at the proper Kentish hour for the morning journey of the heiress to the south door of Zouche Park. The Reverend Octavius gave his daughter his blessing at the south parlour door in the quiet Kentish manner he had kept all the 28 years of her life, laid his hand briefly upon her sleeve, and walked with her to the gate. Amelia gave her father her hand at the chaise step, took her seat upon the dark wool cushion within the Zouche chaise, drew the small Zouche travelling rug across her knees, and the chaise drew out of the parsonage gate in the steady Kentish fashion of a Saturday morning of the country. The road from Zouche on the Weald to Zouche Park ran 6 Kentish miles north by way of the High Street of Tonbridge, where the Zouche chaise drew up at the inn-yard of the Rose at Tunbridge at the proper Kentish hour for the change of horses, the Rose standing at the corner of the Tonbridge Market Square in the long honey-coloured Kent stone of the country, and the inn-yard kept in the settled Tunbridge manner of the house. The landlord of the Rose at Tunbridge brought up at the small south parlour of the inn a plate of cold Tunbridge ham, a small pot of Tunbridge tea, and a plain loaf of the Tonbridge bread, and Amelia took the small refreshment in the quiet manner of a Kentish journey settled before it had begun. The change of horses was made within the half-hour at the inn-yard of the Rose. The 2 fresh Zouche bays were brought out of the inn-stable in plain Zouche livery, and the chaise drew out of the Rose at Tonbridge in the steady Kentish manner the journey had set itself from the parsonage gate. The Tonbridge road southward ran along the long honey-coloured shoulder of the Kentish Weald in the settled fashion the Zouche family had kept the road these 70 years past, the long honey-coloured fields of the Wealden country opening at the south of the road, the hop-yards of the Tonbridge country lying at the east of the road, and the apple and cherry orchards of the home meadow opening at the south of the road as the chaise drew up at the lodge gate of Zouche Park at the gentle close of the Kentish afternoon. The lodge stood at the western edge of the home pasture of Zouche Park, the lodge-keeper's wife at the gate in plain Wealden wool, and the chaise drew along the honey-coloured gravel of the south drive between the long line of the Zouche elms. The honeystone of the south front rose at the close of the drive in the settled 2-storey fashion of the Kent manor Sir Hadrian Zouche's father had built in 1749. The pale tile roof set close at the gable, the stone-mullioned south windows set at the long line of the south front, the 3 brick chimneys rising above the pale tile roof, the south door open at the Kentish afternoon, and 3 figures stood at the south step in the settled fashion of a household that had been at its proper work since the gentle hour of the Kent morning. The chaise drew up at the south step. Mr. Menwaring's man held the chaise door. The small black travelling trunk was handed down at the south step. The small Zouche wicker basket of clean parsonage linen was handed down beside the trunk, and Amelia set her foot upon the south step of Zouche Park for the first hour of her life. Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge, the Zouche butler of 58 Wealden years, and the plain black tailcoat of his settled office, came forward at the south door with the quiet formality of his settled service, and said only that the Zouche household stood at her hand at the south step of Zouche Park at the close of the Kentish Saturday afternoon. Mrs. Isham, the Zouche housekeeper of 56 years, and the lace cap and plum bombazine of her settled office, gave the quiet curtsy of the south door, and said only that the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouche had left the South Library at Zouche Park at the proper Kentish readiness for Miss Zoosh's arrival on the Saturday morning. Mr. Mainwaring, the Zoosh steward of 80 weathered Wealden years, in the plain dark coat of his settled office, gave the formal bow of the south door, and said only that the home pasture, the hop yard, and the apple and cherry orchard stood at her hand at her proper Kentish convenience. Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge handed her in at the south door of Zoosh Park. The honey-coloured Kentish stone of the south hall received the close of the afternoon at the long line of its 3 south windows, the Zoosh family arms set above the south hall fireplace in the plain Tunbridge plaster of 1749, the pale tile roof reaching above the settled stone of the south staircase, and the small line of the Zoosh family portraits hanging in the long honey-coloured fashion the south hall had kept these 71 years past. Mrs. Isham handed her at the south staircase to the long upper gallery of the south wing, and from the south gallery turning to the south library at the south-east corner of the upper floor, where the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouch had kept her settled writing at the south library writing table these 28 years past. The South Library opened at the close of the Kent afternoon at 3 stone-mullioned south windows, and the long honey-coloured shelves of the Zoosh books lined the west wall, the east wall, and the north wall at the settled Kentish fashion the South Library had kept since the year of the building of the house. The settled inventory of Zoosh Park stood at Mr. Raysbury Tonbridge's plain Tunbridge figure. 152 acres of the home pasture, the walled south garden of half an acre, the hop yard of 4 acres of Kentish Goldings at the east of the home pasture, and the apple and cherry orchard of the south meadow. 376 volumes at the long shelves of the South Library, 78 pieces of the Zoosh family plate at the Tonbridge Maker's Mark of 1789, and £3,250 in the 3% at the settled Tonbridge fashion of the Zoosh estate. Mr. Mainwaring had set out the tenant rolls of the home pasture at the South Library writing table. Mrs. Isham had set out the house books of the Zoosh household at the South Library writing table. Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge had set out the plate book of the Zoosh family plate at the South Library writing table, and Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge of High Street, Tunbridge, had set out his Tunbridge copy of the late Mrs. Cordelia's will at the South Library writing table at the close of the December before. The plate book set out the 78 pieces at the Tonbridge Maker's Mark of 1789, the Zoosh tea service, the Zoosh salvers, the Zoosh candlesticks, and the Zoosh ladles, and the tenant roll set out the home pasture and the hop yard and the apple and cherry orchard at the long honey-coloured Wealden tenancies the Zoosh family had kept these 70 years past. The south windows of the South Library opened upon the long Kentish prospect of the Wealden country to the east, the long honey-coloured shoulder of the Kentish Weald, rising at the eastern horizon of the prospect above the home pasture, the hop yard of 4 acres of Kentish Goldings, opening at the east of the home pasture below the rising shoulder of the Weald, and the apple and cherry orchard of the south meadow, lying at the south of the walled south garden, in the long honey-coloured fashion the Zoosh family had kept the south meadow these 71 years past. The walled south garden of half an acre lay below the 3 south windows of the South Library, at the long Kentish fashion of the country. The long honey-coloured hedgerow of the Wealden country running along the eastern boundary of the home pasture, and the long honey-coloured ribbon of the Wealden afternoon opened at the south of the south meadow at the close of the Kentish Saturday. Amelia stood at the South Library writing table, where the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouch had kept her settled writing these 28 years past, and laid her hand upon the bound playbills of the late Mrs. Cordelia of 1782 to 1819, and the Green Calf Theatre Journal of 33 years at Covent Garden, Drury Lane, and the Haymarket which her late great-aunt had set at the South Library writing table at the proper Kentish fashion of the November before, for the hand of her niece. Mrs. Isham came up at the South Library door and brought up the worn Zouche commonplace book of the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouche at the close of the Kent afternoon, and laid it at the South Library writing table at the settled Wealden fashion the late Mrs. Cordelia had kept it these 28 years. Amelia gave Mrs. Isham the quiet thanks of the South Library door, and Mrs. Isham went down at the South Library stair to the housekeeper's office of the South Wing, in the settled Kentish manner of the Zouche household. The bound playbills of 1782-1819 lay at the South Library writing table in the long-settled fashion her late great-aunt had kept them. The Green Calf Theatre Journal of 33 years lay beside the bound playbills at the careful italic of every season of Covent Garden and Drury Lane, and the Haymarket, and the Zouche commonplace book lay at the right hand of the Green Calf Theatre Journal in the long Kentish silence the South Library had kept at the close of the November before. Amelia laid her own settled writing pen beside the bound playbills, set her small black travelling case of the parsonage upon the plain Kent floor, and sat down at the late Mrs. Cordelia's settled chair for the first hour of her settled tenancy at Zouche Park. The first Sunday at St. Peter's of Zouche on the Weald was the Feast of the Epiphany, kept in the quiet Kentish fashion of the parish church the Reverend Belling had kept these 8 years past at the lay patronage of the 6th Earl of Glendower Castle, 10 miles east on the Kentish Weald above Maidstone, and Amelia sat in the Zouche family pew at the south side of the nave in her settled black gabardine and small crape bonnet for the plain Wealden Epiphany service the Reverend Belling gave from the plain Kentish pulpit of the parish church. The Zouche household settled at its proper Kent work in the long honey-coloured fashion the late Mrs. Cordelia had kept these 28 years past. Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge kept the south door and the south hall at the settled formality of his 58 years Wealden service. Mrs. Isham kept the housekeeper's office at the south wing at the settled Kent fashion of her 56 years. Mr. Menwaring walked the home pasture and the hop yard and the apple and cherry orchard at the proper Wealden hours of the country morning. Mrs. Isham's niece, Miss Sophie Isham, of 24 years, came up at the South Library in the quiet Kent fashion of a reading companion, and gave Amelia the settled order of the Zouche house books at the South Library writing table at the long Wealden fashion her aunt had taught her these 6 years past. Amelia took her settled writing at the South Library writing table at the afternoon hours her late great-aunt had kept these 28 years past, the bound playbills of 1782-1819 at her hand, and the Green Calf Theatre Journal of 33 years at her right hand at the settled Kentish fashion. The late Mrs. Cordelia had set them out at the South Library writing table of Zouche Park. The Wealden afternoon came in at the 3 stone-mullioned south windows of the South Library, at the long honey-coloured fashion of the Kent country, the settled Kentish stillness of the South Library, laid upon the long honey-coloured shelves of the Zouche books, and the long honey-coloured hours of the Wealden week kept their steady pace at the south windows of Zouche Park. Upon the Wednesday following the Saturday of her arrival, Sir Anselm Jermyn of Jermyn Hall, near Rochester, dropped his calling card at the south door of Zouche Park by the hand of his clerk in plain Rochester wool. Sir Anselm Jermyn was the 4th Baronet Jermyn of Jermyn Hall, near Rochester, 53, stout, gout-flushed, of the primrose silk waistcoat and oily smile of his settled Rochester manner, and his clerk laid the calling card at the south door, with a folded note of plain Rochester, wove paper sealed at the small German seal. The folded note announced, in the settled Rochester formality of Sir Anselm's clerk's hand, the request of Sir Anselm Jermyn for a private interview at the South Library of Zouche Park upon the Wednesday following at the proper Kentish hour of the country morning. Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge took the calling card and the folded note at the south door, gave the clerk the formal acknowledgment of the south door, and brought up the calling card and the folded note at the South Library in the settled Wealden fashion of his 58 years' Zouch service. Amelia received the calling card and the folded note at the South Library writing table in the settled Kent composure her late mother, Mrs. Mary Russell Zouch, had taught her at the parsonage these 28 years past. She laid the calling card and the folded note upon the South Library writing table beside the bound playbills of 1782, 1819, and the Green Calf Theatre Journal of 33 years, and she gave Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge the quiet thanks of the South Library at the settled fashion of the South Library door. She read the folded note again, in the settled Wealden fashion her late great-aunt had taught her, at the November letter from Zouch. The note set out the request of Sir Anselm in the proper Rochester formality of his clerk's hand, that Sir Anselm should be permitted the private interview at the South Library upon the Wednesday following, upon a matter of Wealden concern between the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouch and Sir Anselm Jermyn, as the same had stood at the close of the autumn of 1818. The note set out no further matter, and was sealed at the small German seal of plain dark wax. Amelia laid the folded note beside the calling card, took her own settled writing pen, and at the quiet close of the Wealden Wednesday, she wrote out a plain letter to Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge of High Street, Tunbridge, enclosing the calling card and the folded note, and setting out in her late great-aunt's settled instruction that the matter of Sir Anselm Jermyn should be laid at Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge's hand at the proper Tunbridge fashion before the Wednesday following. She sealed the letter at the small Zouch seal of plain dark wax, and gave the letter to Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge at the South Library door at the evening hour for the evening post out of Zouch on the Weald to High Street, Tunbridge. Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge took the letter at the South Library door in the settled Kent fashion of his office, gave the formal acknowledgment of the South Library door, and the letter went down at the south staircase to the South Hall, and out at the south door to the small Zouch post-boy at the south step for the Tonbridge Evening Post. The letter went out of Zouch on the Weald at the close of the Wealden Wednesday, in the long settled fashion of the country. The South Library at the 3 stone-mullioned south windows kept the settled Kentish stillness of the close of the Wednesday afternoon. The home pasture lay below the south windows at the long honey-coloured fashion of the Wealden country, the hop-yard of 4 acres of Kentish Goldings opening at the east below the rising shoulder of the Kentish Weald, and the apple and cherry orchard of the South Meadow opening south of the walled garden. Amelia sat at the settled chair her late great-aunt had kept these 28 years past, and she took up the bound playbills of 1782, 1819, at the long honey-coloured page of the early Covent Garden bills her aunt had marked in the careful italic of her own hand. She read the careful italic at the margin of the early Covent Garden bills at the close of the Wealden Wednesday afternoon, and the settled Kentish stillness of the South Library laid upon the long honey-coloured shelves of the Zouch books. The Zouch household kept its proper Wealden pace at the south wing through the close of the week. Mrs. Isham kept the housekeeper's office at the settled Kent fashion of her office. Mr. Menwaring walked the home pasture and the hop-yard and the apple and cherry orchard at the proper hours of the country morning. Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge kept the south door and the south hall at the settled formality of his office. Miss Sophie Isham came up at the South Library, with the settled order of the Zouch house books. The Reverend Belling came up at the quiet Kent afternoon of the Friday following, and gave Amelia the settled greeting of the parish living of St. Peter's at the South Library door. The settled Kentish stillness of the South Library kept at the writing table at the close of the week, and the long honey-coloured shelves of the Zouch books kept their settled silence at the quiet close of the Wealden days. The bound playbills of 1782, 1819 kept the careful italic of the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouch at the margin of every page these 28 years past. The Green Calf Theatre Journal of 33 years at Covent Garden, Drury Lane, and the Haymarket kept its settled silence at the right hand of the bound playbills. The Wednesday following the Wednesday of Sir Anselm Jermyn's calling card stood at the settled Kent hour of the country morning ahead. Wednesday the 19th of January 1820 came over the Kentish Weald in a thin pale light along the hop yard and the apple and cherry orchard at the south meadow. The frost had held at the stone mullioned south windows of the south library through the night, and the rooks above the home pasture were at their morning quarrel, and the smoke at the south library chimney rose straight in the still air at the 3 brick chimneys of the Honeystone Kent Manor of 1749. Amelia Zouche was at the south library writing table in her unrelieved black morning gabardine, with her small lace cap plain at the nape of her plaited, soft auburn hair, her late great-aunt's bound playbills of 1782 to 1819 at her hand, opened at the bound quarto volume of 1818, her own Green Calf Theatre Journal of 1814 to 1819, set out at her right hand at the entry of October 1818, and the inkstand and the steel pen at her left hand in the gentle Kentish fashion her late great-aunt had kept at this writing-table for 29 years. Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge of High Street, Tunbridge, had come up from Tonbridge the evening before. He had taken Mrs. Isham's offered south chamber, and at breakfast he had folded his gold spectacles and observed that the matter of Sir Anselm Jermyn should be at the south library at the proper Kentish hour. He had said no more than that. He had been the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouche's man of business, 29 years, and his Tunbridge wisdom in matters of will and trust and parole claim was at Amelia's hand, the more for being undeclared. The Reverend Belling of St. Peter's of Zouche-on-the-Weald had come over from the parsonage at the proper morning hour. He was in his plain black gown, and he had taken the south library chair to the left of the writing-table at Mr. Raisbury Tonbridge's direction, and he had brought his Greek Testament and laid it at his knee in the silence that was his proper Kentish manner. He had baptized Mrs. Cordelia's husband's elder sister at this parish in 1790, and he had buried Mrs. Cordelia at the south transept of St. Peter's in the December past, and his presence at the south library this morning was at Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge's settled instruction the second disinterested witness the matter required. Mrs. Isham had set out the small tray of Tunbridge sherry at the side table by the south window. She had laid the fire at the south library hearth, and she had set up the writing-stand at Amelia's left hand with the Morning Chronicle and the Morning Post of the 15th of October 1818, brought up from Mrs. Hester Lonsdale's gentle quarter-day packet. She had drawn the chintz half across the south window so the morning light should fall at Amelia's right shoulder and not at her face. She had then withdrawn at Mr. Raisbury Tonbridge's nod to the housekeeper's room beyond the green baize door, and the south library at the writing-table held only the 3 at the table and the steady tick of the long case clock at the north wall. Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge adjusted his gold spectacles and looked at Amelia across the writing-table. "Sir Anselm Jermyn," he said, "by his clerk's folded note of Wednesday last, sets out a parole claim of the September of 1818. He shall come with his barrister, Mr. Tregony. The matter is to be heard in your hearing, Miss Zouche, at the South Library writing-table of Zouche Park, by Mr. Raisbury Tonbridge of Tonbridge for the estate, and the Reverend Belling of St. Peter's as disinterested witness. You shall hear his claim through. You shall make your reply at your own settled hand, and you shall not be pressed at the matter beyond your own readiness. Do I have your understanding?" "You have my understanding, Mr. Raisbury Tonbridge," Amelia said. "You have at the writing-table your late great-aunt's bound playbills of 1782 to 1819. "I have, Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge." "You have your own Green Calf Theatre Journal." "I have, opened at the October 1818 page." "You have the Morning Chronicle and the Morning Post of the 15th of October 1818. "I have, the 2 papers at the writing-stand at my left hand." "You have your aunt, Mrs. Hester Lonsdale's recent letter of January." "I have. set down at Russell Street at the 8th of January 1820. Then we shall await Sir Anselm at the south door. Amelia set the steel pen back at the inkstand. She closed her Greencalf Theatre journal at the page with a thin slip of plain Kentish writing paper laid at the place. She laid her hand at the half-title of the bound playbills volume of 1818, where her late great-aunt's gentle italic had set down See Zouche, Zouche Park, the 7th of November 1818, the season at Covent Garden and at Drury Lane, bound at Tonbridge this November in the Zouche fashion. She did not weep at the italic. She had at this morning the steady Kentish composure of one who has read at her own hand the matter the morning required. Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge at the south door opened to Sir Anselm's barouche at 11 of the clock. Amelia heard the wheels at the gravel, the silence at the wheels, the south door at Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge's hand, the steady step at the flagged passage. Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge announced at the south library door. Sir Anselm Jermyn of Jermyn Hall, he said, and Mr. Tregony, barrister. Sir Anselm Jermyn, 53, stout 5'10", gout-flushed, primrose silk waistcoat, oily smile. He came in at the south library door, with the manner of his usage in the Rochester assembly rooms. Miss Zouche, he said, Sir Anselm Jermyn of Jermyn Hall, your servant. Mr. Tregony, his barrister, thin grey, charcoal wool, plain steel spectacles. He carried a plain black portfolio under his left arm. Tregony, he said, of the Inner Temple, for Sir Anselm. Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge rose at the writing-table. The Reverend Belling rose at the chair by the writing-table. Amelia inclined her head at the gentle Kentish degree, no more, no less, and did not rise. The south library at the writing-table was at her own hand, and at her late great-aunt's settled appointment, and she was the heiress of Zouche Park at the will of Mrs. Cordelia Zouche, by Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge's reading at High Street, Tunbridge, and the rising at the south library writing-table was not at her part to perform. Sir Anselm, Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge said. Mr. Tregony, Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge of High Street, Tunbridge, for the estate of the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouche, the Reverend Belling of St. Peter's of Zouche on the Weald as disinterested witness. Miss Zouche shall hear your matter at her own writing-table. Pray be seated. Sir Anselm took the offered chair at the south side of the writing-table and laid his gold-headed cane at the floor at his right knee. Mr. Tregony drew the second chair at his shoulder and laid the plain black portfolio at his knee, and unfastened the brass clasp at the portfolio with his thin grey hand, and drew out a folded paper of 3 sheets sewn at the left margin with the plain black silk of the Inner Temple fashion. Miss Zouche, Mr. Tregony said, by instruction of Sir Anselm Jermyn of Jermyn Hall, Sir Anselm advances a parole trust set up at the South Library of Zouche Park in the September of 1818 by the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouche in his favour, in respect of the hop yard at the east and the apple and cherry orchard at the south meadow of Zouche Park, valued at the home pasture rental at £400. The matter was discussed at a private interview, the late Mrs. Zouche being then in her settled mind, and Sir Anselm being then at the South Library at her invitation. Sir Anselm shall set out the conversation in his own hand. Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge inclined his head at Sir Anselm at the gentle Tonbridge degree. Sir Anselm, he said, pray proceed. Sir Anselm laid his hand at the gold-headed cane and drew the linen handkerchief from his primrose silk waistcoat pocket and dabbed at his gout-flushed forehead in a manner that was meant to suggest the steady recollection of a gentleman of long acquaintance. Miss Zouche, he said, Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge, Reverend, the matter is at my own settled remembrance, and I shall set it out at the plain country fashion. In the September of 1818, the second Wednesday of the month, by my own pocketbook, I was at Zouche Park, by Mrs. Cordelia Zouche's own invitation. I had carried up from Jermyn Hall a small basket of late Kentish Golding's hops from the Jermyn home pasture, which she had asked at me.
Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge brought me up to the South Library, where the late Mrs. Zouche was at this very writing table at which Miss Zouche now sits. He paused. He folded the linen handkerchief. He laid it at his knee. The conversation, he said, fell at the London Theatre. Mrs. Zouche had her bound playbills volume of 1818 at her hand at this writing table. She set out to me a matter. I have it at my own pocketbook and at my own settled remembrance. At her private interview at the South Library, where I described to Mrs. Zouche the matter in connection with Mrs. Siddons's Lady Macbeth, which I had lately seen at Drury Lane on the Wednesday evening of the 14th of October, 1818. About the sleepwalking scene, as I set out to her, the carrying of the small chamber candle, the laying of the wrong hand, the steady Drury Lane voice at the close. Mrs. Zouche put the matter at me as the figure of the hop yard and the orchard, the steady gathered yield of the east and the south, the gathered Kentish autumn of the late season, and she said that the hop yard at the east and the apple and cherry orchard at the south meadow, being her own particular labour these 29 years past, should at her own settled wish be at my hand at German Hall, where I had set up my own small hop yard from the Goldings cuttings she had given me from her own hand. We discussed the matter at the South Library at her invitation, and the parole trust was set up between us at that hearing in the September of 1818. Mr. Tregony inclined his head at Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge. Sir Anselm's own settled remembrance, he said, is at the pocketbook entry of the second Wednesday of September 1818. And at the conversation at the South Library at Zouche Park. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge shall observe that a parole trust of land at the testator's own hand at her settled mind, evidenced at a conversation of the kind set out, is at the equity of the Court of Chancery, a matter the heiress shall not lightly set aside.
We ask, on Sir Anselm's instruction, that Miss Zouche at the writing table this morning accept the parole trust at the hop yard at the east and the apple and cherry orchard at the south meadow in Sir Anselm's favour, and that the matter be set down at Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge's hand at Tunbridge at the proper instrument. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge did not reply at once. He laid his gold spectacles at the writing table at his right hand. He looked at Amelia across the table at the steady Tunbridge manner that had been his usage with Mrs. Cordelia 29 years. Miss Zouche, he said, you have heard Sir Anselm's matter. You shall make your reply at your own settled hand. Amelia laid her hand at the half-title of the bound playbills volume of 1818. She did not look at Sir Anselm. She did not look at Mr. Tregony. She looked at the writing table and at the bound playbills volume at her hand, and at her own green calf theatre journal at her right, and at the Morning Chronicle and the Morning Post of the 15th of October 1818 at the writing stand at her left, and the steady Kentish composure of the South Parlour at the Parsonage and the South Library at Zouche Park was at her own settled keeping. Sir Anselm, she said, Mrs. Siddons retired from Drury Lane in 1802, and did not perform there again. The 14th of October 1818 Drury Lane bill was Mr. Kean as Hamlet, not Mrs. Siddons. Mrs. Siddons was at Cheltenham that night for Mr. Charles Kemble's benefit. She had not played at Drury Lane that night. The matter cannot have been at the stage you set it out. The South Library at the writing table held the long Kentish silence of the Weald at the close of a winter morning. The fire at the hearth gave out one small fall of coal at the brass dogs. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge did not move. The Reverend Belling did not move. Mr. Tregony's thin grey hand at the folded paper of 3 sheets did not move. Sir Anselm said nothing. His gout-flushed forehead held the linen handkerchief's mark. His oily smile was at the corner of his mouth, and at none of the rest of his face. His gold-headed cane at the floor at his right knee was at the silence of an instrument that had not been called. Amelia drew her green calf theatre journal to the middle of the writing table and turned it at the October 1818 page. She set her finger at the entry of the 14th. Sir Anselm, she said. The Green Calf Journal at the writing table is at the entry of the 14th of October, 1818. The entry reads, Drury Lane, wed 14 Oct 1818. Mr. Edmund Kean as Hamlet, Mr. Pope as Claudius, Mrs. Glover as Gertrude, Miss Smithson as Ophelia. First tier box 14 at the offered hand of my aunt Mrs. Hester Lonsdale of Russell Street. The entry concerns Mr. Kean at Hamlet at Drury Lane. It does not concern Mrs. Siddons or Lady Macbeth. The entry shall stand at your own reading. She turned the journal at Sir Anselm. Mr. Tregony inclined at the journal, at the thin grey movement of a barrister called at a citation his clerk has not verified. He read the entry. He laid the journal back at the middle of the writing table without observation. Amelia drew her late great-aunt's bound playbills volume of 1818 and opened it at the October page. The Drury Lane bill of the 14th of October was at the page at her left hand, the Covent Garden bill at her right. The Cheltenham notice cut from the Cheltenham Chronicle, tipped in at the inner margin in Mrs. Cordelia's own paste. At the bound playbills volume of 1818, she said, the Drury Lane bill of the 14th of October, 1818 sets out. Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, Wednesday evening, October the 14th, 1818. The tragedy of Hamlet. Hamlet, Mr. Kean, Claudius, Mr. Pope, Gertrude, Mrs. Glover, Ophelia, Miss Smithson. The bill does not name Mrs. Siddons. The bill does not name the tragedy of Macbeth. The Covent Garden bill of the same evening is for Miss O'Neill as Juliet. The Cheltenham notice tipped in at the inner margin sets out Mrs. Siddons at the Cheltenham Theatre Royal that evening for Mr. Charles Kemble's benefit night performance of Miss Joanna Baillie's Tragedy of de Montfort in the part of Lady Jane de Montfort. The volume is at my late great-aunt's own paste-up and shall stand at your own reading. She turned the volume at Sir Anselm. Mr. Tregony inclined at the playbill, at Mrs. Cordelia's paste-up, at the moment of the matter at his settled silence. Amelia drew the Morning Chronicle and the Morning Post of the 15th of October, 1818, from the writing stand at her left hand. She opened the Morning Chronicle at page 3. The inner column at the foot ran The Theatres, Drury Lane, and at the third paragraph, Drury Lane. Last night, Mr. Kean appeared as Hamlet at this house before a brilliant audience. Sir Anselm, she said, the Morning Chronicle of the 15th of October, 1818, at the foot of page 3, sets out the Drury Lane bill of the previous evening. Mr. Kean as Hamlet at Drury Lane on the Wednesday evening of the 14th of October, 1818. The Morning Post at the same place sets out the same matter. She set her finger at the second column at the head of page 4. The column ran, Cheltenham Theatre Royal. Last night, for the benefit of Mr. Charles Kemble, Mrs. Siddons, her brother's benefit night, appeared as Lady Jane de Montfort in Miss Joanna Baillie's tragedy. The Morning Chronicle at page 4 sets out Mrs. Siddons at the Cheltenham Theatre Royal at the 14th of October, 1818, for Mr. Charles Kemble's benefit night performance of Joanna Baillie's Tragedy of de Montfort. The Morning Post at the same place sets out the same Cheltenham notice. The two London papers, taken together, place Mr. Kean at Hamlet at Drury Lane and Mrs. Siddons at Lady Jane de Montfort at Cheltenham. The two matters cannot have been at the one stage on the one Wednesday evening. She turned the papers at Sir Anselm. Mr. Tregony inclined at the thin grey movement of a barrister whose instructing client has set out a citation at a London stage the client has not lately attended. Amelia drew her aunt Mrs. Hester Lonsdale's letter of the 8th of January 1820 from the brass blotter at her right hand. The letter was in Mrs. Hester's gentle italic at the plain Bloomsbury Square, laid paper. Sir Anselm, she said, my aunt Mrs. Hester Lonsdale of Russell Street sets out, at her own settled remembrance, that on the Wednesday evening of the 14th of October, 1818, she was herself at Drury Lane at the first tier box, 14 at the tragedy of Hamlet, Mr. Kean as Hamlet, and that she had at the same evening the Cheltenham notice at Mrs. Siddons at the Cheltenham Theatre Royal at her own packet at the Morning Post of the 16th from her Cheltenham correspondent. The matter shall stand at your own reading. She turned the letter at Sir Anselm. Mr. Tregony inclined at the thin grey movement of a barrister whose instructing client has set out a citation at a Drury Lane stage at a Lady Macbeth at a Wednesday evening at which the lady was attested at Cheltenham at Joanna Baillie's de Montfort. Sir Anselm, Amelia said, my late great-aunt Mrs. Cordelia Zoche kept the bound playbills of Covent Garden and Drury Lane and the Haymarket from 1782 until December of 1819. She set in the 1818 volume, the Drury Lane bill of the 14th of October at Mr. Kean's Hamlet, and the Cheltenham notice at Mrs. Siddons at Joanna Baillie's, de Montfort at the same evening at the same paste-up. The matter you set out at Mrs. Siddons at Lady Macbeth at Drury Lane at the 14th of October 1818 is at a bill at a part, at a player at a house at an evening at which she was not at the playing. The matter cannot have been at the stage you set it out. She laid the 2 London papers back at the writing-stand at her left hand. She laid her Greencalf Theatre Journal at her right hand. She laid her hand at the half-title of the bound playbills volume of 1818 at her late great-aunt's gentle italic. She did not speak again. The fire at the hearth gave out one further small fall of coal at the brass dogs. The Kentish wheeled at the south meadow, beyond the south window, held the thin pale light of a morning at the second half of January at the parish of Zouche-on-the-Weald, and the south library at the writing table held the long, settled silence at the close of the matter Sir Anselm had brought up from German Hall. Sir Anselm laid the linen handkerchief at his face. He did not dab. He held it at his face for a count of 7 Kentish seconds at the long case clock at the north wall, and at the close of the 7 seconds he lowered the linen handkerchief at his knee, and the oily smile at the corner of his mouth was gone, and the gout-flushed forehead was a sheet of pale Kentish winter, and the primrose silk waistcoat at his stout 5'10" was at the small, unmistakable collapse of a Rochester baronet whose pocketbook entry at the second Wednesday of September 1818 had been set out at a citation that had not been at any reading, at any South Library, at any Kentish manor, at any year of the 29 years past. Mr. Tregony, he said. Mr. Tregony did not look at Sir Anselm. He laid the folded paper of 3 sheets sewn at the left margin with the plain black silk of the Inner Temple fashion at the plain black portfolio. He fastened the brass clasp at the portfolio at the small Inner Temple click of a matter at its close. He laid the portfolio at the small side table at his right hand. He rose at the chair at the south side of the writing table. Mr. Raysbury Tonbridge, he said, on the citation at the South Library of Zouche Park, as set out, Mr. Tregony of the Inner Temple withdraws Sir Anselm's parole claim at the hop yard at the east and the apple and cherry orchard at the south meadow. Mr. Tregony shall lodge no further instrument at Tunbridge at the matter. Sir Anselm shall be at his barouche at the south door. Mr. Raysbury Tonbridge inclined his head at Mr. Tregony at the gentle Tonbridge degree of a matter settled at the South Library writing table at the proper hearing. Mr. Tregony, he said, Mr. Raysbury Tonbridge of High Street, Tonbridge, accepts the withdrawal at Mr. Tregony's hand on behalf of Sir Anselm Jermyn. The matter shall be set down at Mr. Raysbury Tonbridge's chambers at Tunbridge at this day's date, with the disinterested witness of the Reverend Belling of St. Peter's of Zouche-on-the-Weald, at the heiress's hand and at the estate's hand, that no further citation at the matter shall stand against Zouche Park at any Kentish court at any year. Mr. Tregony is a gentleman. Mr. Tregony inclined at the writing table at the thin grey movement of a barrister, whose Inner Temple courtesy at a citation at its close was at the South Library at the Kentish degree of the matter. Miss Zouche, he he said. "Mr. Tregony of the Inner Temple, your servant. The matter at the South Library is settled at your own hand." He withdrew at the South Library door. Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge, at the flagged passage at the south door, took him through. Sir Anselm rose at the chair at the writing table. He did not look at Amelia. He did not look at Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge. He did not look at the Reverend Belling. He took up the gold-headed cane at the floor at his right knee. He laid the linen handkerchief at the primrose silk waistcoat pocket. He took up the plum frock coat at his stout 510 at the small fastening at the lapel. "Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge," he said, "Sir Anselm Jermyn shall be at the south door." He did not give a parting civility. He turned at the writing table and walked at the South Library door at the gout-favoured step of a Rochester baronet whose pocketbook entry of the second Wednesday of September 1818 had collapsed at the Cheltenham notice at Mrs. Siddons at Joanna Bailey's de Montfort at the hand of the heiress of Zouche Park. Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge at the south door saw him to the barouche. The wheels at the gravel carried at the wheeled lane to Rochester at the proper Kentish degree, and the South Library held the three at the writing table at the settled close of the matter. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge took up his gold spectacles. He set them at his face. He looked at Amelia across the writing table at the steady Tonbridge manner that had been his usage with the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouche. "Miss Zouche," he said, "the matter is settled. Mrs. Siddons has settled it." He took out the small, plain pocketbook at the inner pocket of his dark wool, and the steel pen at the inkstand at her offered nod, and at the Tonbridge hand set down the matter of the morning, the citation, the actual Drury Lane bill, the Cheltenham notice, the 2 London papers, Mrs. Hester Lonsdale's letter, the withdrawal at Mr. Tregony's hand, the disinterested witness of the Reverend Belling, and the date. "I shall set down the instrument at Tunbridge," he said. "Sir Anselm shall not return at the south door of Zouche Park at any further citation." He closed the pocketbook. He laid the steel pen at the inkstand. He looked at the Reverend Belling. "Reverend," he said, "I am at your obligation as the disinterested witness. The Greek Testament at your knee was the settled Kentish degree at the proper hearing. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge of Tonbridge thanks you at the estate's hand." The Reverend Belling inclined at the South Library chair at the gentle Kentish degree of a parish curate at his proper office, at his proper parish. "Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge," he said, "the matter at the South Library was at the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouche's settled wish at the South Library writing table. The parish curate's office at the disinterested witness was at no further matter than the late Mrs. Zouche's settled wish. Miss Zouche shall have the parish curate at the south porch of St. Peter's at any Sunday at the proper Kentish degree." He took up the Greek Testament at his knee. He laid it under his arm at the plain black gown. He rose at the South Library chair. "Miss Zouche," he said, "I shall return to the parsonage at the proper hour." "Reverend Belling," Amelia said, "I am at your obligation at the South Library this morning. The parish curate's hand at the matter shall be at my own settled remembrance at the gentle Kentish fashion of the Zouche family." The Reverend Belling inclined at the writing table at the gentle Kentish degree. He withdrew at the South Library door at the flagged passage at the south door, and Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge saw him to the rectory pony trap that had stood at the south drive. The South Library held Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge and Amelia at the gentle Kentish silence of a matter settled. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge took up his pocketbook a second time. He set out the further matter that the heiress should keep at the South Library the bound playbills volume of 1818, her Green Calf Theatre Journal, the 2 London papers, and Mrs. Hester Lonsdale's letter at the small offered cabinet at her left hand, at the proper Kentish degree of a settled instrument, at any further citation, at any further Rochester barouche, at any further year. Amelia gave the small inclined nod at her late great-aunt's gentle Kentish fashion. Miss Zoosh, Mr. Raspberry Tunbridge said, "The instrument shall be at your hand at the South Library writing table by Wednesday next, by the proper Tunbridge post. The matter of Sir Anselm Jermyn of Jermyn Hall is closed at Zoosh Park." He inclined at the writing table at the Tonebridge degree, and withdrew at the South Library door, at the flagged passage at the South Chamber Mrs. Isham had set out the evening before. The South Library at the writing table held Amelia at her own hand at the bound playbills volume of 1818 at the October page at her late great-aunt's paste-up. Mrs. Isham came up at the green baize door at the small Kentish knock of a housekeeper at her settled hour. She laid the small offered tray of plain Tunbridge tea at the small table at Amelia's right hand without observation at the matter, and she did not speak at the proper Kentish degree, and she withdrew at the green baize door at the close of the matter. Amelia laid her hand at the bound playbills volume of 1818, at the half-title at her late great-aunt's gentle italic, at the matter of C. Zoosh, Zoosh Park, the 7th of November, 1818. She did not weep at the italic at this writing table at this Wednesday at the 2nd half of January, at the parish of Zoosh on the Weald. She had set out at the writing table the matter at the proper bill, at the proper paper, at the proper journal, at the proper aunt's gentle letter. She had kept the bound playbills volume of 1818 at her late great-aunt's settled wish at the proper Zoosh fashion, and the hop yard at the east and the apple and cherry orchard at the south meadow should not be at any Jermyn Hall hand at any further pocketbook entry at any further year. She took up the small offered tea at her right hand. She drank at the proper Kentish degree. She set the cup at the small table. She drew her Green Calf Theatre Journal at her right hand and opened it at the October 1818 page at the 14th at her own gentle italic. She took up the steel pen and sat down at the inner margin. At the South Library writing table, Zoosh Park, Wednesday the 19th of January 1820. The matter shall stand at the bound playbills volume of 1818, at the late Mrs. Cordelia Zoosh's italic at the November paste-up, and at this journal at my October entry. A.Z. She laid the steel pen at the inkstand. She closed the Green Calf Theatre Journal with the thin slip of plain Kentish writing paper at the place. She laid her hand at the half-title of the bound playbills volume of 1818 at her late great-aunt's italic, and the South Library held the long-settled Kentish silence at the Weald at the close of a winter morning, at the parish of Zoosh on the Weald, at the year of our Lord, 1820. The late January at Zoosh settled into a careful rhythm that took Amelia between the South Library at the park and the parsonage at Zoosh on the Weald, 6 miles south of Tonbridge. She kept Mondays at the parsonage with her widowed father, the Reverend Octavius Zoosh, who held the curacy of St. Peter's of Zoosh on the Weald, as he had these 22 years past. She kept Tuesdays for the Zoosh parish poor, with Mrs. Esham at the housekeeper's keys. She kept Wednesdays for the home pasture accounts, with Mr. Menwaring at the steward's strong cupboard. She kept Thursdays for the South Library writing table at her late great-aunt's own Green Calf Theatre Journal of 33 years that Mrs. Cordelia Zoosh had kept at the South Library writing table since her marriage of 1791. She kept Fridays for the South Library at her own Green Calf Theatre Journal of 1814 to 1819 of the London seasons she had kept at her Aunt Mrs. Hester Lonsdale's house at Russell Street in Bloomsbury Square these 5 years past. She kept Saturdays for the parish school Shakespeare reading class at the South Library, with the 6 village girls Reverend Belling had laid at her hand at the rectory tea of the 2nd Sunday of January. She kept Sundays for St. Peter's at the south porch of Zoosh on the Weald, and the rectory tea, following with the Reverend Belling, in the gentle Kentish fashion the late Mrs. Cordelia Zoosh had kept in her own day. In the matter of the London season, Amelia took the Tonbridge chaise to Russell Street at the 12th night of 1820, and kept the winter weeks at her Aunt Mrs. Hester Lonsdale's Bloomsbury house through to Lady Day, attending Eliza O'Neill's Juliet at Covent Garden, Edmund Kean's Shylock at Drury Lane, and a late Mrs. Siddons' benefit night reading at Covent Garden, and keeping each entry at her own Greencalf Theatre Journal at the central crease in the careful Kentish fashion of her 5 London seasons past. In the first week of February, Mrs. Isham at the Brick Hob proposed Miss Sophie Isham, her niece of 24 at Tunbridge Village, as reading companion to the new mistress of Zouche. Miss Sophie Isham was a small, fair, Tunbridge-bred young woman of plain dark wool and a settled honesty, and Amelia accepted her at the South Library on the Thursday following the matter at the Brick Hob. Miss Sophie took up her reading at the South Library window in the afternoons of the Tuesdays and the Wednesdays, sitting at the small, dark oak reading chair the late Mrs. Cordelia had kept at the south wall, and she read aloud from the Reverend Mr. Henry Hart Milman's Fall of Jerusalem of 1820, and from Miss Hannah More's Practical Piety of 1811, in the plain Tunbridge-bred reading voice her aunt had set her to from her own girlhood. Amelia, at the South Library writing table, laid her late great-aunt's Greencalf Theatre Journal at the writing table, and listened to the reading at the gentle Kentish afternoon hour. And the matter of the reading companion was settled at the South Library in the careful manner of the late Mrs. Cordelia's own day. The 6 Zouche village girls of the Saturday Shakespeare reading class were named once at the Reverend Belling's parish school list in the South Library hand of Amelia herself: Hetty Aubrey Tunbridge, at 13, the butler's youngest niece at the village; Patience Mainwaring at 12, the steward's eldest daughter at the home pasture cottage; Damaris Isham at 14, the housekeeper's grandniece at Tunbridge; Letitia Belling at 11, the curate's middle daughter at the rectory; Faith Raisbury Tunbridge at 12, the Tunbridge solicitor's grandniece lodging with her aunt at the village; and Sophie Tregony at 13, the village schoolmistress's daughter, no relation to Sir Anselm Jermyn's barrister of the Wednesday past. These were the 6 who came over from the village on the Saturday afternoons, through the late winter and the gentle Kentish spring. The parish school Shakespeare reading class at the South Library on the Saturday afternoons was, in Amelia's own settled understanding of the matter at the South Library writing table, the chief expansion of her late great-aunt's settled wish at the Zouche playbills of 1782 to 1819. She had the 6 village girls at the South Library at the dark oak reading table from the early afternoon through the close of the afternoon, and she took up with them the gentle reading of the late plays of Shakespeare in the careful Kentish fashion of the South Library reading voice. She read out at the dark oak reading table the speech of Prospero from The Tempest at the 5th act and the first scene, the speech, "Our revels now are ended," at the close of The Masque of the Spirits at the cell of Prospero on the Enchanted Island, in her own gentle Kentish reading voice the late Mrs. Cordelia had kept of her own South Library reading these many years past. She set Hetty Aubrey Tunbridge and Patience Mainwaring at the imagery of the cloud-capped towers and the gorgeous palaces of the opening of the speech; Damaris Isham and Letitia Belling at the imagery of the great globe itself and the solemn temples at the middle of the speech; and Faith Raisbury Tunbridge and Sophie Tregony at the gentle close of the speech at the rounded sleep of the little life. The 6 village girls each took up a small homemade copybook of plain Tunbridge woolcloth at the cover that Mrs. Isham at the housekeeper's keys had set up for the class at the South Press at the upper landing, and they began at the South Library reading table their own small copybooks of the speech of Prospero, copying down at the small reading table the English of the speech Amelia read out at the dark oak in her own gentle Kentish reading voice. The class closed at the close of the afternoon, with Mrs. Isham at the brick hob bringing in the milk and honey at the South Library, and the 6 village girls walking back at Mr. Menwaring's careful direction at the home pasture path to the village. Amelia at the South Library writing table at the close of each Saturday set down in her own green calf theatre journal at the central crease the speech of Prospero the 6 village girls had taken at the class hour, and the small Zouche Parish School Shakespeare reading register the Reverend Belling had laid at her hand at the rectory tea of the 2nd Sunday of January was kept at the South Library writing table in the plain Kentish fashion the late Mrs. Cordelia had kept of her own parish school accounts at the Zouche, living in her own day. The parish school Shakespeare reading class at the South Library, on the Saturday afternoons through the late winter and the early spring, took up the speech of Prospero at the close of The Tempest at the South Library, reading voice at the 6:20, Saturday hours from the 2nd Saturday of January through the last Saturday of April. And by the close of the April, the 6 village girls of the Zouche parish had each a small homemade copybook of the speech of Prospero, drawn from Amelia's own green calf theatre journal of 1814 to 1819 of the Covent Garden and the Drury Lane and the Haymarket of her own London seasons past. Mr. Menwaring walked the home pasture at his usual rounds through the late February and the early March, and reported the lambing at the South Meadow as fair for the year, the steward's strong cupboard rentals at the plain Kentish reckoning of the late Mrs. Cordelia's own books these many years past, and the hop yard at the east at 4 acres of Kentish Goldings, as settled at the Tonbridge dressing. The Wednesday afternoon at the South Library window came in upon Zouche with the soft Kentish light of an early spring afternoon at the South Library writing table, and Amelia at the South Library writing table opened her late great-aunt's bound playbills volume of 1791 at the dark oak reading chair the late Mrs. Cordelia had kept at the south wall. She had not before opened the bound playbills volume of 1791, having read through the volumes of 1782 to 1790 at the close of the Sir Anselm German matter, and the volumes of 1792 to 1810 at the dark oak of the February. The bound playbills volume of 1791 was a plain dark calf folio of London 1791, with the italic of Mrs. Cordelia Zouche at the inner leaves, and Amelia turned through twice the pages of the spring of 1791, and came at the close of her turning to the page of the 14th of May, 1791, at the Covent Garden Theatre. She found at that page, laid in at the margin, a Covent Garden playbill of that night, Mrs. Siddons as Volumnia in Coriolanus at the close of the spring season, and at the margin of the playbill, in the italic of her late great-aunt's own hand, a settled note. This 14th May, 1791, the night of my own wedding to dear Hadrian at St. Margaret's of Tonbridge, Mrs. Siddons at Covent Garden as Volumnia. My niece, Mrs. Mary Russell Zouche, shall have her own Mrs. Siddons night in her own time. The bound playbills are for that hand. Cizé. The 14th of May, 1791, was the morning of her late great-aunt Mrs. Cordelia's own wedding at St. Margaret's of Tonbridge to the late Sir Hadrian Zouche, the marriage Amelia had heard of in passing at the parsonage south parlour, these many years past, in her father's plain Kentish reserve at the small Tonbridge miniature of the Zouche family of 1791, at the south parlour writing desk. Her late great-aunt had laid in at the bound playbills volume, at the page of her own wedding night, a Covent Garden playbill of Mrs. Siddons as Volumnia, as her own, settled labour against the 28 years that lay between her wedding night and the niece-to-be of her sister, Mrs. Mary Russell Zouche of the parsonage. The niece-to-be, Mrs. Mary Russell Zouche, had been newly with child in the spring of 1791, and would lay her first daughter at the parsonage of Zouche on the Weald at the Kentish August of 1791, 3 months after the 14th of May playbill. The niece-to-be of the playbill was Amelia herself. Mrs. Cordelia had laid aside the bound playbills volume 8 and 20 years before for the niece-to-be of the parsonage. The shared trait of the theatre journal at the South Library writing table squared at Zouche across the 8 and 20 years between her late great-aunt's bound playbills volume of 1791 and her own green calf theatre journal of 1814 to 1819. Amelia closed the bound playbills volume of 1791 and stood at the South Library window in the soft Kentish light of the early spring afternoon in a settled silence of 10 minutes. The South Library window gave at the home pasture and the apple and cherry orchard and the walled South Garden at the east, and the soft Kentish light stood at the South Library writing table at the bound playbills volume at the page of the 14th of May. Mrs. Isham at the brick hob in the kitchen at the south passage was silent at the housekeeper's keys. The late Mrs. Cordelia's own green calf theatre journal of 33 years stood at the dark oak open at the May of 1791 page. Amelia took up her own green calf theatre journal of 1814 to 1819 at the dark oak reading table at the South Library window, and copied down at the central crease in her own italic the entry of the 14th of May, 1791, of Mrs. Cordelia's bound playbills volume, the Covent Garden playbill of Mrs. Siddons as Volumnia, the italic note of her late great-aunt's hand at the margin at the wedding night at St. Margaret's of Tonbridge, and the settled wish of Mrs. Cordelia that the bound playbills should be for the hand of the niece-to-be of the parsonage. She laid the bound playbills volume at the South Library writing table at the close of the entry, and laid her own green calf theatre journal at the central crease at the dark oak reading table. The matter of the bound playbills volume at the page of the 14th of May, 1791 was settled at Zouche at the close of the spring afternoon in the plain Kentish reckoning of the Weald parishes. The Wednesday of the 12th of April brought the Reverend Belling over from the rectory to the South Library tea, and he confirmed, in his Kentish reserve at the South Library window, that Mrs. Cordelia Zouche, at her last conversation at her south bedchamber in the November of 1819, had asked him to bring "my small wheeled candle," the late Mrs. Cordelia's own settled name for Amelia at the parsonage these many years past, the bound playbills volume of 1791, at the page of the 14th of May of the Covent Garden playbill of Mrs. Siddons as Volumnia, with my settled asking pardon. The Reverend Belling had meant to speak of the matter at the South Library at the close of January, and had let the parsonage to Zouche settling, and the Sir Anselm German matter of the Wednesday of the 19th of January pass first. He asked Amelia's pardon for the plain Kentish delay. The Reverend Belling observed at the South Library window, in his plain Zouche parish curate's manner, that the late Mrs. Cordelia had, at the south bedchamber, asked him to lay the matter at Amelia's hand at the parish curate's own settled discretion, and that she had asked him further to say at the South Library, in her own settled wording, that the 6 Kentish Weald miles between Zouche Park and the Zouche on the Weald parsonage had been at her hand to bridge from the spring of 1791 onward, the spring of her wedding to dear Hadrian at St. Margaret's of Tonbridge, that she had not, in the matter of the Reverend Octavius Zouche of Rochester and the parting of 1788, brought herself to the bridge, and that the bound playbills volume of 1791, the playbill of Mrs. Siddons as Volumnia, laid in on her own wedding night for the niece-to-be at the parsonage, was the matter she had meant the small wheeled candle to take up at the South Library writing table in her own time. Amelia received the Reverend Belling's confirmation at the South Library window in her own settled silence, and asked the Reverend Belling to take the South Library tea in the plain Kentish fashion her late great-aunt had kept on the rectory tea Wednesdays of her own day, Mrs. Isham at the brick hob laying the small Zouche tea service of 1791 at the South Library writing table. Lady Day Quarter Day at the 25th of March brought Mr. Mainwaring to the South Library writing table with the home pasture accounts and the steward's strong cupboard rentals settled at the plain Kentish reckoning of the late Mrs. Cordelia's own books, the rentals of the Zouche Weald parish tenancies at the home pasture, and the apple and cherry orchard, and the walled south garden, and the hop yard at the east, brought up at the plain steward's hand of his 30 years at the Zouche, living in the plain fashion her late great-aunt had kept of the Lady Day quarter-day these many years past. In the middle of April, Mrs. Isham at the housekeeper's keys brought up the Zouche family pearls, a single strand of small Tunbridge-set river pearls of 1789 in a worn dark calf case. The Zouche pearls Sir Hadrian Zouche had set at the Tonbridge goldsmiths for his bride, Mrs. Cordelia Zouche, at the spring of 1789. The pearls Mrs. Cordelia had kept at the upper press at the South Landing through her widowhood of 1809 to 1819. And laid them on the South Library writing table at Amelia's own settled wish. The worn dark calf case set at the South Library writing table at the close of the afternoon in the plain Kentish fashion of the Weald parishes, the late Mrs. Cordelia had kept of the Zouche family pearls these many years past. The Wednesday of the 12th of April at the South Library, at the close of the Shakespeare reading class hour, the 6 village girls presented Amelia at the South Library window with a small calf-bound wildflower album of the Kentish Weald hedgerows. The 6 girls had gathered through the early spring at the South Meadow and the apple and cherry orchard, and the village schoolmistress, Mrs. Tregony Pusey's own well-used copy of Mr. Croxall's 1722 Aesop's Fables in plain Tunbridge woolcloth at the cover. The wildflower album laid at the writing table at Amelia's hand by Hetty Aubrey Tunbridge at the close of the class hour. By the late April, the half-mourning at Zouche had eased by the gentle Kentish reckoning of the 4 months past the December of 1819, and Mrs. Isham at the housekeeper's keys produced from the late Mrs. Cordelia's South Press at the upper landing a cream and peach sprigged muslin morning gown of the Tonbridge dressmaker's hand of 1818, that Mrs. Cordelia had not lived to take into wear. Amelia took the muslin into wear at the South Library at the close of the month, in the gentle Kentish fashion her late great-aunt had kept in her own day, the unrelieved black gabardine set by at the upper press. Easter Sunday at the 23rd of April 1820 came in upon Zouche on the Weald in the soft Kentish light of the late April morning at St. Peter's. Reverend Belling preached the Easter sermon from the Epistle of the Morning, in his plain Kentish fashion, at the south pulpit of St. Peter's. Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge at the south door of the church had received the parish at the south porch in the early morning, and Mrs. Isham at the Zouche pew at the south aisle had laid the Zouche pew cushions at the dark oak. Amelia at the Zouche pew in her cream and peach sprigged muslin and a small sprig of early Kentish hopbine at the bodice, took the parish Easter service in the gentle Kentish fashion her late great-aunt had kept at this pew these many years past. After the close of the service, the parish came out at the south porch of St. Peter's into the soft Kentish light of the Easter Sunday late morning, and Reverend Belling at the south porch inclined to a tall, lean, honey-fawn-coated gentleman who had stood at the rear of the south aisle through the service and who had come forward at the close to the south porch. The 6th Earl of Glendower was tall, lean 6'1", dark chestnut hair lately silvering at the temples, warm hazel eyes the colour of Kentish honey at the autumn close, weathered fair Oxford-trained skin, the silver Glendower signet on his right hand, honey-fawn morning coat over cream waistcoat. Reverend Belling at the south porch inclined to Amelia, and inclined to his lordship, and made the introduction in his settled Kentish fashion verbatim at the south porch of St. Peter's of Zouche on the Weald. Miss Zouche, his lordship Algernon Aubrey Glendower, 6th Earl of Glendower Castle, 10 miles east on the Kentish Weald above Maidstone. Lord Glendower is the lay patron of the Zoche, living these 8 years past, and a member of the Beefsteak Club at the Covent Garden Theatre these 5 years past. Lord Glendower at the South Porch inclined to Amelia in the Oxford-trained Kentish fashion of the Weald parishes. He observed at the South Porch in his settled plain manner that he had known the late Mrs. Cordelia Zoche from the year of his own coming down to Glendower Castle in 1812 through to her last autumn of 1819 at the Covent Garden Theatre at the first tier Box 2. The Zouche box of the late Sir Hadrian Zouche's settling of 1791, adjacent the Glendower box of his own father's settling of 1798, and that he had seen the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouche at the Covent Garden first tier Box 2 at every season from the autumn of 1812 through the spring of 1819, as the considered Kentish Weald theatre observer of the Covent Garden seasons. He observed at the South Porch in his Oxford-trained manner that he had been moved at the December bereavement of the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouche at the close of the year past, and had laid his own small condolence at the rectory at the second week of December at the Reverend Belling's hand. He observed that at Mrs. Hester Lonsdale's salon at Russell Street in Bloomsbury Square at the Easter of 1817, Mr. Henry Crabbe Robinson of the Inner Temple had laid at his hand at the salon writing table one of Amelia's own green calf theatre journal pages of the spring of 1817 of Eliza O'Neill's Juliet at Covent Garden, and that he had at the time remarked at Mr. Henry Crabbe Robinson's hand the Oxford quality observation of the theatre journal entry. The cross-reference Amelia had set down at the margin to the parallel imagery at the potion scene at the close of the fourth act, the suggested sense of Mrs. Siddons's late benefit night reading at Covent Garden at the spring of 1817, and the marginal note at the gesture of Eliza O'Neill at the close of the potion scene that Lord Glendower had not before seen at any of the Covent Garden box-holders' hands. He observed, in his plain Kentish manner at the South Porch, that he had not in his 8 years at Glendower Castle expected to see that hand continue at the South Library writing table after the December of 1819, and that the matter of the parish school Shakespeare reading class at the South Library at the Saturday afternoons through the late winter and the early spring had been brought to his hand at Glendower Castle by the Reverend Belling at the 3 Sunday Rectory teas past, Amelia at the South Porch in her cream and peach sprigged muslin and the small sprig of early Kentish hopbine at the bodice received Lord Glendower's settled observation in the gentle Kentish fashion her late great-aunt had kept in her own day at this porch. She inclined to his lordship in the manner of the Zouche on the Weald parsonage of her own girlhood. She replied at the South Porch in her own settled trait, in the plain Kentish fashion of the Weald parishes. Lord Glendower, the theatre journal at Zouche I shall continue at my late great-aunt's settled wish. Lord Glendower at the South Porch inclined to Amelia at the close of her sentence, in the Oxford-trained Kentish fashion that the Weald parishes had known of the lay patron of the Zouche living these 8 years past, and observed that he was glad of the matter, and that he should hope to make his settled call at the South Library at Zouche at the Tuesday following the close of Easter week, if the new mistress of the park should receive him at the South Library at the gentle Kentish hour the late Mrs. Cordelia had kept for her own Tuesday calls in her own day. Amelia at the South Porch, in the soft Kentish light of the Easter Sunday late morning, inclined to Lord Glendower, and replied that she should receive Lord Glendower at the South Library at the Tuesday call the late great-aunt had kept in her own day, and the matter at the South Porch was settled in the plain Kentish fashion of the Weald parishes. Reverend Belling at the South Porch walked Amelia and Lord Glendower to the lich gate of St. Peter's at the South Churchyard wall, where the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouche's plain Tonbridge set memorial stone of December 1819 stood at the south wall at the third grave from the Lich Gate in the plain Kentish fashion that Weald parishes had kept of the Zouche family these many years past. Lord Glendower at the Lich Gate took his leave of Reverend Belling and of Amelia in the Oxford-trained Kentish fashion, and walked at the south churchyard path to the Glendower Castle carriage that had stood at the rectory wall through the close of the service. Amelia at the Lich Gate took her own leave of Reverend Belling in the plain Kentish fashion of the Weald parishes, and walked back at the Kentish south churchyard path to the south door of Zouche Park, Mrs. Isham at the housekeeper's keys, 3 paces behind in her plain plum bombazine and her settled lace cap. The south churchyard path from the Lich Gate of St. Peter's to the south door of Zouche Park took the half-mile of Kentish Weald meadow at the south edge of the home pasture, past the small footbridge at the Weald stream, and the apple and cherry orchard at the east of the walled south garden. In the plain Kentish fashion, the Zouche family had walked at the Easter Sundays of these many years past. Amelia, at the south door of Zouche Park, inclined to Mrs. Isham at the close of the half-mile, and Mrs. Isham, at the south door, took the cream and peach sprigged muslin bonnet at the inner hall in the plain Kentish fashion of the late Mrs. Cordelia's own day. The matter of the south porch at the Lich Gate at St. Peter's at the Easter Sunday of the 23rd of April was settled at Zouche at the plain Kentish reckoning of the late Mrs. Cordelia Zouche's own settled wish. Saturday, the 6th of May, 1820 came in fair over the Kentish Weald, and the south door of Zouche Park stood open to a Kent morning of the kind Mrs. Cordelia had loved at the close of her life. Amelia Zouche had laid her late great-aunt's bound playbills of 1782, 1819 at the South Library writing table, with the Green Calf Theatre Journal of 33 years beside them, and her own Green Calf Journal of 1814-1819 at the inner edge of the table. She had set a small jug of Kentish bluebells at the lectern. Mrs. Isham had aired the long south room since the early morning, and the brick hob held the kettle at the simmer that her great-aunt's housekeeper had kept these 30 years. At the close of the morning, the gravel of the south drive was taken by the wheels of Lord Glendower's chariot, and Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge opened the south door to the party from Glendower Castle. Lord Algernon Aubrey Glendower came up the south steps first, tall, lean 6'1", dark chestnut hair lately silvering at the temples, warm hazel eyes the colour of Kentish honey, the silver Glendower signet at his right hand, honey fawn morning coat over a cream waistcoat, and behind him his daughter, Lady Cordelia Glendower. Lady Cordelia was 8, with soft auburn hair under peach ribbons, warm hazel eyes, and a small white muslin pelisse. Lady Honoria Glendower, Lanesborough, followed, his married sister, 39, in plum silk and Brussels lace, her mouth gentle and considered. Mr. Marmaduke Lanesborough handed her up the step, 44, fair-haired, plain dark wool, the easy Kentish civility of a Maidstone magistrate. The Dowager Lady Glendower came last on her son's arm, 66, small and upright, silver hair under a black lace cap, plain mourning silk for her late daughter-in-law these 4 years past. Mrs. Isham received the party at the South Hall in plum bombazine and a fresh lace cap, and showed them through to the South Library, where Amelia stood at the inner side of the writing table in cream and peach muslin half-mourning, her soft auburn hair plaited at the nape under a small lace cap, and the Zouche pearls of Tonbridge 1789 at her throat. The Dowager Lady Glendower took the south-facing chair at the brick hob, Lady Honoria the cushioned chair beside her mother, Mr. Lanesborough the writing chair at the inner table, Lord Glendower the upright chair at the lectern, and Lady Cordelia, in 8-year-old gravity, the small low stool that had been Mrs. Cordelia's own at the south window. Mrs. Isham poured the tea from the silver Tunbridge 1789 pot, and Amelia handed the cups to each in the Kent fashion her late great-aunt had kept. The Dowager Lady Glendower spoke first, in the considered Kent voice of a manor 66 years lived in. Miss Zoosh, we have come over the 10-wheeled miles from Glendower Castle this morning at my own son's settled wish, that I might at last see at the South Library the small wheeled candle of whom our dear Mrs. Cordelia wrote to me in the October past. I am very gratified to find you at your great-aunt's writing table, and the bound playbills at your hand. Amelia set the silver cream jug down. Lady Glendower, Mrs. Cordelia spoke of you to Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge in the November past. I am very honoured to receive you at the South Library this morning. Lady Honoria inclined gently at the cushioned chair. My dear Miss Zoosh, my mother has not been over the 10-wheeled miles since the December bereavement, and Marmaduke and I have come down from Maidstone on purpose. The bound playbills at the writing table are the same hand my mother knew at Mrs. Cordelia's Covent Garden box in 1815. Mr. Lanesborough nodded at the inner table. Miss Zoosh, the matter at the January South Library was much spoken of at Maidstone quarter sessions. I am very gratified to see the theatre journal continuing at Zoosh. Lord Glendower had risen from the upright chair at the lectern, and stood now at the inner edge of the writing table, where the bound playbills lay open at the Covent Garden 1815 page. He laid his weathered fair hand at the margin of the page, and looked up at Amelia with the warm hazel eyes that her own warm hazel eyes had met at the Easter porch a fortnight past. Miss Zoosh, he said, the South Library at Glendower Castle has stood neglected at the theatre record side since my late wife's death in the autumn of 1816. The Covent Garden bills shelf at the south wall, where I had laid out at my beefsteak years the 1812-1819 papers I had myself attended at the late Mrs. Siddons's benefit nights, has been closed these 4 years. I am asking now, in the Kent fashion of a neighbour 10 miles east on the Weald, whether you might lay out at the Glendower Castle South Library a small theatre records collection, the Covent Garden bills of the 1812-1819, late Mrs. Siddons' benefit nights, at a Tuesday afternoon at your settled convenience, that my own daughter Lady Cordelia, and my sister Lady Honoria, and my mother the Dowager, might see at one Kent afternoon what the Green Cuff Journal at this table has set out. Amelia laid her gentle hand at the inner margin of the writing table. Lord Glendower, I shall be very gratified to lay out the theatre records collection at the Glendower Castle South Library at a Tuesday, at your convenience. Lady Cordelia rose from the small low stool at the south window and crossed the South Library in 8-year-old gravity to the inner edge of the writing table where her father stood. She laid her small hand at the corner of the Covent Garden 1815 page. Miss Zoosh, she said, may I help with the playbills? Amelia looked down at the soft auburn head and the peach ribbons and the warm hazel eyes that were her father's eyes in 8-year miniature. Lady Cordelia, I should be very glad of your hand at the playbills. The Dowager Lady Glendower inclined at the south-facing chair. Lady Honoria laid her plum-silked hand at her mother's. Mr. Lanesborough set down his teacup at the inner table, and Lord Glendower, at the inner edge of the writing table, did not say anything at all in the Kent fashion of a South Library May morning. The Tuesday calls began the week following and ran through the May fortnight and into the close of June. Reverend Octavius Zoosh came over from the parsonage for the May fortnight and sat at the second sash of the South Library with his sewing, the plain, dark Kent mending of a curate's housekeeping, while his daughter and Lord Glendower laid Lord Glendower's own privately printed notes on the late Mrs. Siddons at Covent Garden, London, 1815, 53 pages, at the lectern between them. Lord Glendower had taken the considered notes at his beefsteak years from 1815 forward. At the late benefit nights of Mrs. Siddons, he had himself attended in the box at the first tier. The Volumnia of 1815, the Constance of 1816, the Catherine of 1817, the Lady Randolph of 1818, the Queen Catherine Farewell Benefit of 1819, and had laid the bill of each at the recto and his own observation at the verso in the Oxford italic of a Christchurch hand. The London binding was plain blue paper boards, with a small gilt rule at the spine, and the title page bore the Glendower arms above the date. Amelia had not before considered his Siddons vs O'Neill pages at the Constance of 1816. She set her own green calf journal beside his London quarto at the lectern, and they read the parallel passages through the slow Kent afternoon. He had not, at his Covent Garden box in 1816, considered the Siddons vs O'Neill distinction Amelia had drawn against Sir Anselm at the South Library in the January past, the Mrs. Siddons sleepwalking scene of the Lady Macbeth, and Miss O'Neill's potion scene at the close of the fourth act of the Romeo and Juliet, set the one against the other in Amelia's considered Kent hand. He listened with his weathered fair hand at the inner margin, and inclined, and asked at the close of the hour whether she might set out at her own green calf journal the careful note of the O'Neill potion scene against the Constance verso of his London quarto. Amelia set out the note the Tuesday following, in the careful italic of her late great-aunt's hand, and Lord Glendower bound it into his London quarto at the Glendower Castle binding desk the Wednesday after. On the Tuesday of the 23rd of May, at the close of an hour at the lectern, Amelia set down her green calf journal at the inner edge, and looked up to ask Lord Glendower the small Covent Garden question she had laid by since the Wednesday previous, and caught his warm hazel eyes already at her own, one gentle moment too late to look away. The Wednesday walks began that same week, and ran through the May fortnight and through June. Lord Glendower would come over the 10-wheeled miles at the late morning on his fair bay Kent mare, and they would take the south wall out to the home pasture, and along the southeast hedge to the dry stone wall at the head of the hop yard. Mr. Mainwaring walked the home pasture at the same hour, with the two Zouch collies at his heel, and inclined as they passed at the orchard gate. On Wednesday the 7th of June, Lord Glendower stopped at the southeast corner of the dry stone wall, where the Kentish Golding's hop-vine grew at the south side of the wall, above the small spring, and gathered a small sprig between his weathered fair hand and the upper stone. He turned, and gave it into Amelia's hand in the Kent silence of the open weald. Amelia laid the sprig at the inner edge of her own soft palm, and placed it in the linen pouch at her reticule, and they walked on to the home pasture without speaking. The Kentish Golding's hop-vine was the wheeled stock Mrs. Cordelia had set at the East Hop Yard in the soft May of 1791, against the years that had separated her from Mr. Marmaduke Zouch's house. In the last week of June, Lord Glendower asked, at the close of the Tuesday hour at the lectern, whether the Saturday calls at Zouch might be requested at a settled hour the month following, that Lady Cordelia and Lady Honoria and the Dowager might be over again from Glendower Castle. Amelia inclined at the inner edge of the writing table, and said that the Saturday calls would be received at 3 at Zouch through July. The Saturday calls came in through the July afternoons. On the Saturday of the 8th, Lady Cordelia brought her own small copybook of the Covent Garden 1815 playbill, copied out in her 8-year-old italic at Glendower Castle, and laid it at the lectern beside Amelia's green calf journal. On the Saturday of the 15th, the Dowager Lady Glendower asked at the south-facing chair after the Zouch pearls of Tonbridge, 1789, and Amelia laid them at her hand at the brick hob. On the Saturday of the 22nd, Lady Honoria and Mr. Lanesborough brought down their two daughters, Sophie and Mary, from Maidstone, and the South Library held 7 at the lectern between 3 and 5, and on the Saturday of the 29th, Lord Glendower laid at the inner edge of the writing table his London 1815, Notes on the late Mrs. Siddons at Covent Garden, with a small folded paper at the verso of page 11, a fair-copied observation of the Volumnia of 1815 in his Oxford italic, set out for Amelia's hand against the Volumnia at her own green-calf journal of 1818. Saturday the 5th of August, 1820 came in fare to Zouch at 3 of the afternoon. Lord Glendower had come over the 10-wheeled miles at the late morning, and had sat at the South Library through the Siddons hour at the lectern, and at the close had asked Amelia whether she might take the south wall out to the small parlour rug at the South Orangery. Mrs. Isham had set the South Orangery to the August fashion of Mrs. Cordelia's, with the small Persian parlour rug at the inner side of the orange tree, and a low Kent seat at the cold flag. Lord Glendower stood at the inner edge of the parlour rug, and Amelia at the cold flag at the inner side of the orange tree. He did not speak at the first long Kent moment, and she did not speak. Then he laid his weathered fair hand at the inner margin of the low Kent seat, and the warm hazel eyes that had met her own at the southeast corner of the dry stone wall on the 7th of June met her own again at the inner side of the orange tree at the South Orangery. "Miss Zouch," he said, "I shall not lay this out in the Oxford fashion of a Christchurch address. I am 41, and I have been widowed at Glendower Castle these 4 years. I am asking now, on no other ground than that I have read the gentle italic of your theatre journal these 4 months, and known by your late great-aunt's 1791 wedding playbill that your hand is the next hand at the Zouch playbills, to do me the honour of becoming the next Countess of Glendower. The South Library at Glendower Castle shall stand at your hand, and the Covent Garden bill's shelf at the south wall, and the soft Kent afternoons of my daughter Lady Cordelia. My own settled wish is that the Zouch-bound playbills at the South Library shall continue at your great-aunt's writing table at every Tuesday hour, with Lady Cordelia at the small low stool at the south window, as Mrs. Cordelia would have asked. I should be very honoured at your settled answer." Amelia laid her gentle hand at the inner margin of the low Kent seat. "Lord Glendower, I shall." She looked up at his warm hazel eyes, at the cold flag at the inner side of the orange tree. "I shall, and I should be glad of the small Tuesday playbill hour at the South Library to continue, by Lady Cordelia's settled wish, even after the wedding bells of Zouch." Lord Glendower did not move from the inner edge of the parlour rug at the first long Kent moment. Then he inclined at the inner margin of the low Kent seat. "My dear Miss Zouch, I had not, until this Saturday minute at the parlour rug, foreseen the gentle Kent quiet at the close of the Tuesday hour shall be the small candle of my own Glendower Castle evenings to come. I am very gratified by your settled answer." Mrs. Isham brought Lady Cordelia down from the South Library at the close of the South Orangery half-hour, and stood at the cold flag with her plum bombazined hand at the small auburn head. Lord Glendower turned at the inner edge of the parlour rug. "Cordelia, Miss Zouch shall be the next Countess of Glendower." Lady Cordelia took the news with the 8-year-old gravity of a Glendower Castle daughter, and looked first at her father, and then at Amelia at the cold flag at the inner side of the orange tree, and then at Mrs. Isham at the inner margin of the South Orangery door. She crossed the small Persian parlour rug, and laid her small hand at Amelia's gentle hand at the inner margin of the Kent seat. "Miss Zouch," she said, "I am very gratified. May I keep the small Tuesday playbill hour at the South Library at Zouch, even after the wedding bells?" "Lady Cordelia, the small Tuesday playbill hour at the South Library at Zouch shall keep by your settled wish, even after the wedding bells." Lady Cordelia inclined at the inner margin of the Kent seat, in the considered fashion of her grandmother the Dowager, and went back to Mrs. Isham at the cold flag at the South Orangery door. The banns were called at St. Peter's of Zouch on the Weald by Reverend Belling on the Sundays of the 13th, the 20th, and the 27th of August. Mrs. Tunbridge, the village dressmaker, came up to Zouche through the last fortnight of August, a small spare Kent woman of 55, plain grey wool, her hair under a plain white cap, and laid out the cream Kentish muslin morning gown at the south parlour fitting room with her 2 apprentice nieces from the village. Saturday the 9th of September 1820 came in fair to the Kentish Weald at the early autumn close of the summer. Amelia rose at the south chamber at first light and stood at the south casement and watched the Weald open to the Kent morning. Mrs. Isham came up at the close of the breakfast hour with the Zouche pearls of Tonbridge 1789 and the small silver locket that had been her late mother, Mrs. Mary Russell Zouche's, at the wedding of the 4th of May, 1790, at St. Peter's of Zouche on the Weald. Mrs. Tunbridge came up at the close of the dressing hour with the cream Kentish muslin morning gown and the 1 white and cream rose from the south orangery, and the sprig of late summer Kentish hopbine that Mr. Mainwaring had gathered at the southeast corner of the dry stone wall at first light. A little before the bells, Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge came up the south steps in plain dark wool and his gold spectacles, and Amelia came down the south stair on his civil arm. The cream Kentish muslin morning gown stood at her gentle 5'5" frame. The sprig of late summer Kentish hopbine and the 1 white and cream rose were laid at the bodice. The Zouche pearls of Tonbridge 1789 stood at her throat. The ivory silk gloves were at her hands, and the small silver locket of her late mother, Mrs. Mary Russell Zouche, was at the inner pocket of the morning gown at the side of her heart. The bells of St. Peter's were rung at 10 of the morning. Mr. Raisbury Tunbridge gave the bride away at the south door of the church. Reverend Octavius Zouche sat at the front pew, in plain black wool, his weathered fair hand at the prayer book. His late wife, Mrs. Mary Russell Zouche, had been given at her confirmation at Rochester in 1788. Mrs. Hester Lonsdale sat at the front pew at his hand, in plain dark London silk, her Bloomsbury composure at the close of her sister's daughter's wedding day. Reverend Belling stood at the chancel in plain black gown. Lord Glendower stood at the chancel rail in honeyfawn wool over a cream waistcoat, with Mr. Lanesborough at his right hand. Lady Cordelia sat at the second pew in cream muslin and peach ribbons. The Dowager Lady Glendower and Lady Honoria Glendower Lanesborough sat at the second pew at her hand. Mrs. Isham and Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge and Mr. Mainwaring sat at the third pew. Miss Sophie Isham sat at the fourth. The 6 village girls, Hetty Aubrey Tunbridge, Patience Mainwaring, Damaris Isham, Letitia Belling, Faith Raisbury Tunbridge, and Sophie Tregony sat at the 5th. Mrs. Tunbridge, the village dressmaker, sat at the 6th, at the inner side of the south aisle. The Kentish Weald held quiet at the chalk above the south churchyard. Reverend Belling read the marriage service of the Book of Common Prayer at the chancel, and Lord Glendower made his vow in the considered Kent voice of a Glendower Castle manor, and Amelia made her own in the gentle Kent voice of a Zouche on the Weald parsonage. The ring was given at Mr. Lanesborough's hand. The register was signed at the vestry by the bride's gentle Kent hand, Amelia Glendower, formerly Zouche, and by Lord Glendower's, and by Mr. Raisbury Tonbridge's, and by Reverend Octavius Zouche's, and by Reverend Belling's. The bells of St. Peter's were rung at the close of the service. The wedding breakfast was laid at the south dining room at Zouche Park at the close of the morning service. Mrs. Isham had set the Tonbridge 1789 plate at the long Kent table, the 78-piece service that had been Mrs. Cordelia's own at her Tunbridge wedding in 1791, and Mr. Aubrey Tunbridge stood at the south door in plain dark wool. The long Kent table held a small bowl of white and cream roses from the south orangery at the centre, and a sprig of late summer Kentish hopbine at each cover, and the Zouche silver candlesticks of Tonbridge 1789 at the 2 ends. The party sat 16 at the table, with the bride and Lord Glendower at the head, and Reverend Octavius Zoche and the Dowager Lady Glendower at the foot, and Lady Cordelia at the bride's soft hand. Mrs. Hester Lonsdale sat at Reverend Octavius's right. Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge sat at Lord Glendower's right. Lady Honoria and Mr. Lanesborough sat at the bride's left. Reverend Belling sat at Reverend Octavius's left. The Kentish ham and the late summer pear, and the cream and the plain weald, honey and the small game pie, and the cold cut of Kent fowl were laid in the Kent fashion of Mrs. Cordelia's own house. Mrs. Isham poured the chocolate from the silver Tunbridge 1789 pot at the side table. The weald opened soft at the south casement. Reverend Octavius Zoche rose at the close of the breakfast and laid out, in the Kent voice of a curate at the close of his 22nd year at St. Peter's, the small, careful blessing his own father, the Reverend Augustus Zoche of Rochester, had laid out at his own wedding to Mrs. Mary Russell Zoche at St. Peter's on the 4th of May, 1790. The chariot from Glendower Castle was brought up at the south door, and the bride and Lord Glendower took the wheeled road east for the 10 miles to Glendower Castle at the close of the September day. If this gentle Kent afternoon at Zoche Park has rested at your hand, please tap the like and the subscribe, and tell me at the comments which Mrs. Siddons' benefit night at the lectern at Zoche you should have read first. And so, on the gentle September morning of the 9th September, 1820, in the parish church of St. Peter's of Zoche on the Weald, in the soft Kentish fashion the Zoche family kept all their days, Miss Amelia Zoche, who had sat at the south parlour of the Zoche on the Weald parsonage on the soft Wednesday morning of the 22nd of December, and heard read aloud by Mr. Raysbury Tunbridge the sealed letter of the great aunt she had never met, became, by the patient asking of the 6th Earl of Glendower, the 11th Countess of Glendower, in the gentle Kentish fashion her own late mother, Mrs. Mary Russell Zoche, had kept all her days.